My name is Jared Ellison, and for most of my marriage to Talia, I was nothing but a placeholder, a steady, forgettable man she could mold into whatever she needed until something better came along. That was the dynamic she preferred, someone who wouldn't overshadow her shine. When we first met at that neighborhood block party, I let her believe what she wanted. I kept my background private. My father's empire, the multi-billion-dollar Ellison Holdings, remained a carefully guarded secret. I'd spent years watching Trust Erode when people learned what my last name meant. My father always warned me, they'll see your net worth before they see you. So I kept quiet, choosing instead to live in the shadows of my own legacy. Talia liked that. She liked the idea that I worked in logistics, middle management at best, someone who knew how to order supplies and talk to truckers, but didn't know how to handle the big deals. She liked the idea that she was the ambitious one, the one with the connections and the Instagrammable brunches. She liked the attention she got when she wore her designer shoes to the office parties. Attention I funded without question. She liked my silence because she mistook it for insecurity. And maybe, in the beginning, it was. Maybe I thought I was protecting us by keeping my name out of the headlines and my wealth out of reach. But with every dinner party she planned, every reservation she made at restaurants I paid for, I saw her hunger for more than I could be in her eyes. She wanted a husband who reflected the power she pretended to wield. She wanted a man with a title that carried weight in every room, a name that would get her seated at the right table. And I let her believe I was just another face in the crowd, someone who would be grateful for the scraps of her attention. She underestimated me. She always did. The truth was, I never needed the trappings of status to feel like a man. My father raised me to understand that respect couldn't be bought. It had to be earned. The best lessons weren't learned at board meetings, but at 3 a.m. in the quiet hum of the old warehouse floors, where my father taught me the rhythm of business like it was a heartbeat. When you know what it means to build something from scratch, you don't need to flaunt it. But Talia never understood that. To her, everything was about appearances. She needed the illusion of success to validate her existence. I watched it happen slowly, the way she leaned into the lifestyle I gave her. The way she arranged her friends like accessories on her social media. The way she craved Lucien Marlowe's attention the moment he appeared at that gala. Shiny, polished, the perfect combination of name and game. The son of a former president. An easy ticket to the kind of power she thought she deserved. I could see the shift in her eyes when he introduced himself, how her posture straightened, her voice softened, her smile stretched a little too wide. I knew, even then, that my days as her husband were numbered. It didn't matter that I'd given her everything she asked for. The condo with the rooftop view, the leased Mercedes she drove like a status symbol, the diamond bracelet she posted on Instagram with a caption about how hard work pays off. I'd given her a life she couldn't have built on her own. But she didn't see it that way. She saw a man who worked in logistics, someone who blended in, someone who wasn't enough. And so, when Lucien Marlowe came along with his smooth talk and his promise of the world on a platinum platter, she didn't hesitate to trade up, at least in her mind. When the text came, it was a single line that cut deeper than any lawyer's letter could. I found someone who matches my ambition. Like I was just a stepping stone on her way to a better future. Like I'd never mattered. I remember staring at that screen, the words blurring as the anger hit me. Not because she left. I'd felt that coming for months. No, it was the cold finality of it. The way she discarded me like a broken toy she'd grown tired of. That was what hurt the most. I didn't respond. I didn't beg. I didn't even ask why. Because deep down, I already knew the answer. I'd always known. She wasn't interested in me, she was interested in the idea of me. The image of stability I projected, the safe harbor until something flashier came along. And that's what she found in Lucien Marlowe, the flash. The connections. The photos that would make her mother proud. I'd spent too long playing the man she thought I was, the man who'd let her take everything and ask for more. But what she didn't know, what she never took the time to understand, was that I was never that man. I was more than a last name or a paycheck. I was the heir to an empire my father built with grit and iron will, and I'd spent years preparing to carry it forward. I'd spent nights at the office, studying ledgers and blueprints, learning every inch of the family business from the bottom up. I knew what it took to lead, to protect, to build. I wasn't a placeholder. I was the future she never thought to look for. I deleted her message, closed my phone, and stood by the window of the apartment she decorated with her designer taste. I let the city lights blur into a watercolor of neon and regret. She'd chosen her path. She'd chosen her partner. And I would let her have it. Because soon, very soon, she'd realize the man she thought I was only a fraction of the man I actually am. And when that day came, I wouldn't have to say a word. She'd see it for herself. She chose the restaurant herself. One of those trendy places downtown with a reservation list longer than a senator's excuses, all reclaimed with tables and exposed brick, like a place that needed to remind you how important it was just to sit down. I paid for it, of course, my name on the black Amex that carried a credit line higher than her salary, though she'd never admit that. I arrived a few minutes early, the way I always did, because my father taught me punctuality was a kind of respect. I'd half hoped maybe she'd come to talk. Maybe she'd want to work through things, though part of me already knew better. That hope was the same one that used to make me buy her flowers on Thursdays, just because. It was the same hope that had me pick out the lease on the car she drove, the one she now used to shuttle Lucien around town like a trophy. She arrived 10 minutes late, the way she always did. A swirl of perfume and self-importance, clicking heels like the starting gun of a race I'd already lost. She was wearing the red-soled designer shoes I'd bought her for our anniversary, a gift she'd unwrapped with a polite kiss on the cheek before checking her phone for messages from him. I watched her glide across the floor, head held high, scanning the room to make sure the right people saw her. That was Talia, always performing for someone. She didn't even bother with small talk. She just sat down, slid the Cartier bag across the table, and crossed her legs. Like we were negotiating a contract and not dismantling a life. "Don't make this dramatic," she said, her voice a practiced calm that never quite reached her eyes. She picked up the wine glass, Chateau Margaux, for $100 a bottle, my treat, and sipped like it was tap water. "You'll land on your feet. Somewhere." Her words felt rehearsed, like lines she'd practiced in front of a mirror. Maybe Lucien had helped her draft them. He seemed the type to enjoy that sort of cruelty. From across the room, I saw him sitting at the bar, one arm slung over the back of a leather stool, a smug grin on his face as he watched her deliver the final blow. I wondered if he was enjoying the show. Probably. A man like him didn't get to be who he was without enjoying a little spectacle. I picked up the Cartier bag slowly, turning it over like it might contain a scorpion. She'd always been one for theatrics. Inside, nestled among tissue paper and the faint scent of her perfume, were the divorce papers, signed, dated, notarized. Clean. Efficient. Like she was handing me an invoice for services rendered. My name on the top, hers on the bottom, and a space for me to sign away the years we'd built together. The house, the memories, the quiet mornings. All gone with a flick of her pen. She watched me with that same cold detachment she used on waiters and housekeepers, like I was a step in her routine. "Go ahead," she said, lifting her chin. "Sign it. Let's not drag this out." "Lucien and I," she paused, eyes flicking to where he sat, then back to me. "We're happy. I don't want to make this messy." She smiled like she was doing me a favor, like I should thank her for her mercy. I felt something inside me harden, a steel edge I hadn't needed with her before. But now, it was exactly what I needed. Because she'd mistaken my silence for weakness too many times. She'd mistaken my respect for fear. She didn't know me at all. I picked up the pen slowly, felt its weight. The same kind of pen my father used to sign million-dollar contracts and balance sheets that carried more zeros than she'd ever seen in her life. I met her eyes, steady and unblinking. "No need to drag it out," I said softly. "I agree." My voice was calm, a practiced quiet that reminded me of the nights I'd spent in my father's office, learning the difference between noise and substance. I signed my name with a flourish, Jared R. Ellison, like I was approving a business plan. Because that's what this was to her, a transaction, a negotiation she thought she'd won. When I finished, I closed the pen and set it gently on top of the papers. "There you go," I said. "Nice and clean." She blinked, surprised. Maybe she'd expected tears. A plea. A promise to change. But I'd already changed. She just didn't see it yet. Across the room, Lucien's grin widened. He raised his glass to me like a man toasting a victory. I didn't look away. Let him think he'd won. Let him enjoy the spotlight for now. Because I knew something they didn't. The game wasn't over. It had barely started. She leaned back, relieved. "Good," she said. "That's the best way. No drama." She reached for the bag, but I held it back. "You can keep it," I said. "It suits you." Her eyes flickered, confusion written in the lines of her perfectly manicured face. She didn't understand. She'd never understand. because she'd always been too busy performing to see what was real. I stood up slowly, smoothed my jacket, and gave her the same calm smile I'd given clients who underestimated me. "Enjoy your dinner," I said. "I'm sure Lucien's got plenty of stories to tell you." I left the table, letting the murmur of the restaurant swallow her confusion. As I walked past Lucien, he smirked and gave me a nod like he was the king of this little chessboard. "You know, she deserves someone who matches her ambition," he said, voice smooth as glass. I paused just long enough to look him dead in the eye. "You're right," I said. "She does." He blinked, a flicker of confusion crossing his face, but I didn't give him the satisfaction of an explanation. I walked out into the night, the city lights sharp and cold against the dark sky. I didn't need to explain myself to either of them, because soon they'd learn that ambition looks different in the shadows. I took a deep breath and felt the air settle in my chest. The city moved around me, oblivious to the empire they'd just tried to discard. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even surprised, because I knew who I was, and I knew what was coming next. Talia thought she'd walked away with everything she wanted, but she hadn't even scratched the surface of what I had to offer or what I was about to become. And for the first time in a long time, I felt free. Free from her expectations. Free from the weight of her need to be seen. I was no longer the man she thought I was. I was the man I'd always been, finally ready to show the world. The apartment I moved into after I left Talia wasn't flashy. It was tucked away on a quiet street near the old Ellison textile warehouse, one of the first properties my father bought when he started the company. I liked the familiarity of the exposed brick and the smell of sawdust from the small woodworking shop down the block. It reminded me of him. Of those nights he'd bring me along to inspect shipments or talk to the night foreman. I'd sit on a stack of old pallets, legs swinging, while he taught me the language of balance sheets and back orders, patience and timing. Lessons most people thought came from a boardroom, but that my father taught me on warehouse floors and loading docks. Talia had never wanted to visit those places. She called them dusty. She didn't understand that's where the bones of an empire were laid. When I left, I didn't pack much. A suitcase, a few shirts, the same worn leather briefcase I'd carried since my internship days. I left her the condo, the furniture, the car, all things I'd given her, things she'd bragged about to her friends. Let her keep them. They were tokens of a world she thought she'd mastered. I took with me the one thing she never bothered to ask about, myself, my name, my legacy. The quiet strength I'd learned from my father, the calm that came from knowing exactly who I was, even when the world didn't. I didn't answer her texts after that. She sent a few at first, testing the water, maybe hoping I'd beg her to come back or at least ask why. "Can we talk?" she wrote. It doesn't have to be messy. But she'd already made it messy, hadn't she? She'd served me divorce papers like a party favor. I deleted the messages without opening them. Let her think what she wanted. I was done explaining myself to someone who had only ever wanted me to fit her image of success. My father taught me that when people show you who they are, you believe them. And she'd shown me, over and over. I went back to work the way I'd always done, quietly, efficiently, without a fuss. My father's private office was on the top floor of the Ellison Holdings Tower, a place I'd walked into 1,000 times before. But this time felt different. I wasn't just the kid with the famous last name. I was the man who would someday wear that name in the CEO's chair. Ronan Ellison had built the company from a single warehouse into a global powerhouse, and every brick, every ledger, every deal had been laid by his hands, or mine, learning at his side. It was time to remind myself, and eventually the world, who I really was. I didn't post anything on social media. Talia had always been the one with the curated feed, the perfect captions, the filtered snapshots of a life that looked better than it felt. I didn't need that. My father had always said, the ones who talk the most are the ones who do the least. So I stayed quiet. Let the headlines write themselves about Talia and Lucien's glamorous new relationship. Let her think she'd traded up. Because while she was chasing likes and champagne toasts, I was learning. I was studying. I was preparing. Late nights in the office became my routine again. I liked the quiet. The way the city looked from 40 floors up, like a million tiny lights in a sea of darkness. I'd sit at my father's desk, still marked by the dents of 100 conversations, and study the architecture of our empire. I read every file, every investment portfolio, every small stake in every company we'd quietly acquired over the years. My father had taught me to understand not just what we owned, but why. How to build loyalty with the small suppliers who kept our distribution lines running. How to predict the market before it moved. Talia had always thought it was just about the money, but she never saw the strategy, the patience, the grit. I'd spent years absorbing that knowledge like oxygen, and now it was time to use it. Some nights, I'd catch my reflection in the glass and wonder if the man staring back at me was the same one who'd let Talia talk down to him in restaurants, who'd sat silently while she planned her exit strategy. He wasn't. The man I saw now carried the quiet weight of knowing exactly who he was. The silence wasn't a weakness anymore. It was a weapon. Because when you stop explaining yourself to people who will never understand you, you start to hear your own voice again. The one that matters. One night, around midnight, I got a text from an old friend in logistics. He'd seen Talia at a gala, some fundraiser she'd once said was too boring to bother with. When we were together, now I must attend since she was on Lucien's arm. She's working the room, he wrote, selling that new lifestyle like it's her brand. I smiled at the irony. She'd always been good at selling the image. But that was all it ever was, an image. A curated story for the world to admire. And Lucien? He was the perfect accessory, polished, connected, but ultimately hollow. I didn't respond to the message. I didn't need to. Because every time Talia played her game in public, she was writing the next chapter of her own downfall. And I didn't need to lift a finger to make it happen. My father noticed the change in me. He never said much. He wasn't the type to waste words. But I saw the way he watched me during meetings. The way he let me lead discussions, guide strategy, handle difficult conversations with board members. It was a test. And every time I answered, I saw the flicker of pride in his eyes. He'd always said the company would be mine one day. But he wanted to be sure I'd earned it. That I wasn't just coasting on the family name. That I understood the architecture of empire and how to protect it from people like Lucien and Talia. I thought of Talia sometimes, how she'd look if she saw me now, sleeves rolled up, eyes focused, plans forming that she couldn't even begin to comprehend. She'd always wanted the man she could show off, the man she could brag about at brunch. But she'd never wanted the man who carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. She'd never wanted the man who made the hard decisions, who understood that sometimes you had to stay silent until the moment was right to speak. That was the man I was now. And she'd walked away from him before he ever had a chance to reveal himself. I didn't hate her for it. Not anymore. Hate was a waste of energy, something my father taught me. Never let anyone live rent-free in your head, he'd say. They'll take up space that should be reserved for your plans. And I had plans, big ones. For the company, for my future, for the legacy I'd build on top of the one my father had started. Plans that didn't include explaining myself to anyone who'd never cared to listen. As the weeks passed, the world moved on. Talia's Instagram followers loved her new relationship with Lucien, at least on the surface. But I'd heard whispers from the finance circles. Lucien's investments were shaky, his father's influence waning, his charm wearing thin in the boardrooms that actually mattered. My father always said, a con man can only shine as long as the mark keeps buying the story. And Talia? She was the perfect mark. She'd traded stability for flash, substance for style. And now, the foundation she'd built her new life on was cracking. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need to tell her I'd always been the man she thought she wanted, but better. Because soon enough, she'd see it herself. She'd see it in the way Lucien's deals fell apart, in the way the media stopped caring about their gala photos, in the way the world forgot the name she'd thought would carry her to the top. And by then, I'd be so far beyond her reach that even if she wanted to come back, she'd find nothing but the echo of a man who'd learned the power of his own silence. And in that silence, I found a strength I didn't know I had. A clarity. A purpose. I was no longer the man she thought I was. I was the man my father had always believed I could be. And that was more than enough. The elevator ride to the executive wing of Ellison Holdings felt longer than usual that morning. Maybe it was the weight of the file folder in my hand, an updated strategy document my father had asked me to review. Or maybe it was the memory of Talia's text echoing in my head, her words as cold as the platinum ring she'd taken off without a second thought. Either way, the air in that steel box felt different, charged with something electric and unspoken. I leaned against the mirrored wall, watching my own reflection calm, collected, unreadable. I'd perfected that look over years of playing the man no one expected, the man who let others assume. When the doors finally opened, I stepped out into the reception area of the top floor. A space that had always felt like a kingdom in itself, with its high ceilings and marble floors, the city skyline laid out like a chessboard beyond the glass walls. I knew every inch of this place. I'd spent my childhood wandering these halls with my father, learning which doors led to the conference rooms and which led to deals that could change an industry. But this morning, the familiar felt foreign. Because there, in the reception chairs, sat Talia and Lucien. Lucien was perched with that careless confidence he'd perfected, one arm draped over the back of the chair like he owned the place. He was mid-laugh when I stepped out, some inside joke he'd probably shared at a dozen boardrooms already, always the same routine. Talia, in a cream silk blouse that looked like it cost more than some people's monthly rent, turned at the sound of my shoes on the floor. Her eyes widened for a second, a flicker of recognition, or was it something else? Regret? I didn't know. But she quickly gathered herself, brushing a non-existent hair from her sleeve, her lips curving into that polished, polite smile she'd perfected for every cocktail hour. Jared, she said, her voice smooth as the satin blouse she wore. What brings you here? She crossed her legs, the movement deliberate, calculated. Like a move in a game she thought she'd already won. Looking for a handout? Her tone dripped with condescension, like she'd just offered me a seat at the children's table. Lucien chuckled, his eyes sliding over me like I was a footnote. We don't hire broke guys, he said, smirking. The way he leaned back told me he was enjoying this, a man who'd spent his life stepping on others to lift himself higher. I didn't react. That's what they wanted, some sign of embarrassment, a crack in the armor that would confirm their victory. But I learned long ago that silence is the most powerful answer. It's the answer that makes people nervous, makes them fill the space with their own insecurity. I moved past them and took a seat, resting the file folder in my lap. I let the quiet stretch out like a piece of thread between us. Talia's smile faltered first. She glanced at Lucien, who shifted in his chair, his smirk slipping just a fraction. I could almost see the wheels turning in their heads. Why wasn't he reacting? Why wasn't he explaining himself? I leaned back, folding my arms. Don't worry, I said, my voice steady. I'm not here for a job. Lucien's eyebrows twitched, and Talia's mouth opened like she wanted to say something, but no words came out. That's the thing about people like them. They expect the world to revolve around them, but the moment you take that away, they're left standing in the dark. I watched as she tried to piece it together, her eyes flicking to the reception desk, then back to me, like she was searching for a clue she'd missed. Lucien just looked bored, like he was ready to move on to the next conquest. But I wasn't giving them anything. Let them sweat in the silence. The receptionist, a young woman named Kylie who'd been at Ellison Holdings since she graduated college, gave me a small nod of recognition from behind her computer screen. She knew me, not just as the son of the boss, but as the man who'd sat with her during her onboarding to answer her questions about the company. Because that's what my father had taught me. Know every name, every story. That's how you build something that lasts. I watched her glance nervously at Talia and Lucien, then back at me. She didn't know what to say either, but I didn't need her to. The silence was enough. Lucien cleared his throat, his voice dripping with forced politeness. Well, he said, I'm sure you'll find something, somewhere. Maybe a small consulting gig? I hear those are good for guys like you. He smiled, showing teeth that looked too perfect to be real. I wondered how many times he'd practiced that smile in the mirror, how many times he'd used it to close deals that were all smoke and mirrors. Talia's fingers drummed nervously on her thigh, the rhythm betraying her composure. I didn't bother to answer Lucien. He wasn't worth the breath. Instead, I let the quiet answer him. Because in that quiet was 1,000 stories he'd never understand. Stories of late nights in warehouses, of ledgers balanced by hand, of deals negotiated over cups of burnt coffee with men who'd built their lives on sweat and risk. Stories of a father who taught me the difference between wealth and worth. Lucien would never know that kind of story. And Talia? She'd chosen to ignore it. That was her loss, not mine. When the double doors to the executive wing swung open, I knew the moment had arrived. My father's presence filled the space like a storm, calm and powerful, but with an undercurrent of something that demanded respect. Ronan Ellison didn't walk into a room. He owned it. His eyes landed on me first, a small nod of acknowledgement, then flicked to Talia and Lucien. He paused, his face unreadable for a beat. And then, like a bolt of lightning, the air shifted. What are they doing here? He barked, his voice sharp enough to cut glass. Lucien's smirk disappeared. He stood, trying to straighten his jacket, but it didn't help him look any taller. Mr. Ellison, he started. We're here to discuss a potential partnership. My father didn't let him finish. I don't care who your father is, he snapped. I fired your father from our board last week for fraud. And now you show up here? Get out. Both of you. The room fell silent. The kind of silence that swallows all the noise, leaving only truth behind. Talia's face paled. She looked at me then, really looked at me, and for the first time in months, I saw the realization dawn in her eyes. She'd never known who I was, and now it was too late. I'd never seen my father move that fast. 1 second, the conference room doors were closed, a quiet buffer between the high-stakes world inside and the lobby outside. The next, they were thrown wide open, slamming against the walls with a force that rattled the glass. My father, Ronan Ellison, stood there, a storm in a tailored suit, eyes blazing like a man who had built an empire from the ground up and would watch it burn before letting it be disrespected by people like Lucien Marlowe. The hush that followed was absolute. Even the receptionist stopped mid-call, her mouth frozen in an unspoken apology. My father's gaze cut through the room like a blade. He scanned the space, lingering first on me, just for a moment, and then on Talia and Lucien, who sat there like a pair of children caught sneaking candy before dinner. "What are they doing here?" he demanded, his voice the calm before a thunderclap. The kind of voice that made men pause and reevaluate their decisions. I'd grown up hearing that voice at board meetings and on job sites, a voice that didn't need volume to command attention. Lucien flinched, his posture stiffening as he tried to stand but couldn't quite find his footing. Lucien cleared his throat. "Mr. Ellison, we're here to discuss a partnership," he said, his tone dripping with the kind of fake humility that came from a lifetime of charm school dinners and country club memberships. "My father," he started, but that was as far as he got. My father's hand shot up, silencing him like a conductor cutting off the music. "I don't care who your father is," he snapped, his voice carrying across the marble like a challenge. "I fired your father from our board last week for fraud. And now you think you can walk in here, into my house, and ask for a partnership? Get out. Both of you." The silence that followed felt like it might swallow us all. I could hear Talia's breath catch, a sharp, ragged sound that echoed in my chest. She turned to Lucien, her lips parted, eyes wide, as if waiting for him to fix this, like he had some magic trick that would make it all go away. But Lucien was frozen, his mask of confidence slipping with every second that passed. My father's words hung in the air, undeniable and final. He'd fired Lucien's father, and by extension, Lucien himself, from the kingdom they tried to infiltrate. I watched as the realization settled on Talia's face. Her eyes flicked to mine, desperate, searching for the man she'd once thought she could manipulate. But I wasn't that man anymore. I never really was. I leaned back in my chair, arms folded, and watched the scene unfold like a play I'd seen 100 times before. Lucien tried to rally, his voice cracking as he looked my father in the eye. "Mr. Ellison, with all due respect," he began, but my father's glare cut him off at the knees. "Respect," he spat. "You want respect? You and your father tried to bankrupt one of our subsidiaries for your own gain. You used my son's name to pitch your scam." His voice dropped to a dangerous calm, the kind of calm that made even seasoned board members sweat. "You think that buys you a seat at this table? Get out. Now." Lucien's jaw clenched, his eyes darting between my father and me, as if hoping for an ally. But I gave him nothing. He tried to humiliate me, tried to take what wasn't his. He didn't deserve an ally. Beside him, Talia's composure cracked. Her perfectly painted lips trembled, and for the first time since she'd walked out of my life, I saw her facade slip. "Jared," she whispered, as if my name was a lifeline she could cling to. "Wait." But my father wasn't finished. He turned his gaze on her, his eyes like steel. "You," he said, his voice low. "You enabled him. You thought you could walk in here with that smirk and your cheap alliances and fool my family. You're no better than he is. Get out." Talia's hand trembled as she reached for her bag, the Cartier gift bag she'd once used to deliver my divorce papers. The same bag she'd flaunted like a trophy. Now it was nothing but a reminder of her mistakes. Lucien grabbed her arm, trying to pull her up with him, but she hesitated, her eyes locked on mine. "Jared," she started again, but I didn't move. I didn't speak. I let the silence say everything I never had to. Because she'd made her choice a long time ago, and now she was living with the consequences. Lucien pulled her to her feet, his face red, his jaw tight. "Come on," he growled. "We're leaving." He didn't even look at my father as he dragged her toward the elevator. My father stood tall, his hands clasped behind his back, the very image of unyielding authority. He didn't watch them go. He didn't need to. They were already gone, their power crumbling with every step. The doors slid shut with a hiss, sealing them off from this world, my world. The one they'd never been worthy of. The silence that settled after they left was different, calmer, resolute. My father turned to me, his eyes softening for a fraction of a second. "You handled it well," he said, his voice quieter now. "You didn't let them rattle you." I nodded, feeling the weight of the moment settle on my shoulders. "You taught me well," I said. He let a small smile crack through his usually stoic face. "That's why you're ready," he replied. "Ready for the rest." I didn't know exactly what the rest looked like yet, but I knew one thing for sure. It didn't include Talia or Lucien. Their chapter in my life was closed, locked tight like the double doors that had slammed shut behind them. I had no intention of reopening it. I'd spent too long trying to prove myself to people who never cared to understand me. Now, I was done explaining, done seeking approval from the wrong audience. My father's presence reminded me of the legacy that mattered. The one I'd inherited, the one I'd been trained to protect. And in that moment, I knew I was ready to carry it forward. I took a deep breath, the air tasting like freedom and responsibility all at once. The elevator dinged in the distance, signaling Lucien and Talia's descent. I didn't watch it. I didn't need to, because I knew the empire my father had built, and the one I was about to lead, was stronger than any cheap betrayal. I was no longer the man they thought I was. I was the man who would rebuild what they tried to tear down. And they'd never see me coming. Talia's face turned pale, like she'd seen a ghost, when the last syllable of my father's words echoed through the glass and marble of that executive wing. "He doesn't work here," my father said with that iron certainty that left no room for argument. "He owns this floor, this wing, this building." The words hung there, sharp and merciless, like a guillotine. She'd always prided herself on reading a room, but now she was trapped in one she never really understood. I watched the way her hands trembled, the way her perfect posture deflated as the truth crashed down on her like a wave. Lucien's grip on her arm tightened. He was trying to steer her toward the exit, but her eyes locked on mine, wide and pleading. "Jared, why didn't you say anything?" she whispered. Her voice was small, brittle, so different from the woman who'd served me divorce papers like a birthday invitation. It was almost a child's voice, asking for an explanation she'd never wanted to hear before. I didn't rush to answer. I wanted her to feel every second of that silence, to let it remind her of all the silences she'd filled with her own assumptions, her own projections of who she thought I was. "You weren't interested in who I was," I said finally, my tone calm but edged with the kind of clarity you can't fake. "You only cared about what I wasn't." I let the words land. No apologies. No explanations. Just the truth, something she'd never wanted from me, only from the version of me she'd invented to serve her ambition. Lucien's jaw was tight, his face the color of curdled cream. He yanked her arm. "Let's go," he spat, his tone like poison. But Talia was frozen, her eyes darting between me and my father, like she was searching for an exit that didn't exist. She'd always been so good at controlling the narrative, twisting a story to fit her needs. But in that moment, she had no script to follow, no rehearsed lines. Just the raw truth. I wasn't the man she thought I was. I was the man who owned the empire she tried to erase me from. As they stumbled toward the elevator, the receptionist, Kylie, who had always treated me like a person rather than a paycheck, handed Lucien a manila envelope. "Mr. Marlowe," she said, her voice steady and polite, "your resume." The envelope was sealed, unopened. Lucien's face darkened as he snatched it from her, his hand trembling. The irony was sharp enough to make me smile. Lucien Marlowe, son of a former president, the man who tried to talk down to me minutes earlier, now reduced to a name on a piece of paper that would never be read. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime. I watched them step inside, watched Lucien's hand on Talia's elbow like a man dragging his baggage behind him. I wondered how long it would take her to realize he was just a different version of the same lie she'd built her life around. The doors slid shut with a whisper, and the room felt different, lighter somehow. My father turned to me, his eyes full of that quiet approval he never gave easily. "You handled it well," he said, his voice softer now, like a conversation between equals. I nodded, the adrenaline finally seeping from my muscles, leaving a calm satisfaction in its place. "I learned from the best," I replied, and I meant it. Because every lesson he'd ever taught me about business, about loyalty, about watching and waiting, had led to this moment. The day when the mask Talia wore cracked wide open, leaving her face to face with the man she'd never bothered to see. I thought back to all the times I'd sat across from her at dinner. Her eyes glazed over as I tried to tell her about my day, about the deals I'd closed, the teams I'd led, the hours I'd put in to build a future for us. She'd always nodded politely, but her mind was somewhere else, probably already planning the next party, the next promotion, the next shiny thing she could post online. She'd never wanted a partner. She'd wanted a pedestal, and I'd refused to be her pedestal any longer. Now, as I stood there, the quiet hum of the office filling the space where her voice used to live, I realized just how much I'd let her shrink me over the years. The man she thought I was, the safe, steady one, was just a small piece of who I really am. And maybe I'd let her believe that because I thought it would make things easier. But the truth was, it only made it easier for her to leave, easier for her to think she'd traded up when she walked away. She never understood the quiet strength it took to build an empire from the shadows. But she would now, because that empire was mine, and there was no place in it for her. My father placed a hand on my shoulder, his grip firm but not heavy. "You've got this, son," he said. No more than that. Just a simple statement of trust from a man who'd never handed out trust lightly. I nodded, feeling a weight lift that I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying. The weight of her expectations, her disappointments, her illusions. They were gone now, left in that elevator, on their way to a life that had no place in mine. I turned back to my father's office, the floor-to-ceiling windows casting the morning sun across the hardwood in golden stripes. I could see the city laid out before me. Skyscrapers and side streets, parks and alleys. All of it within reach. All of it waiting. I thought of the deals waiting to be made, the strategies that would shape the next decade, the people counting on me to lead them. And for the first time in a long time, I felt ready. Behind me, the echoes of Talia's world falling apart faded into silence. I didn't feel sorry for her. She'd made her choices. She'd built her life on illusions and used me as a placeholder. Now she'd have to build something real with Lucien, if he didn't abandon her the way he'd abandoned every other partnership that stopped being profitable. But that wasn't my concern anymore. My concern was here, in this building, with the people who'd always believed in me, even when I didn't make it easy. I took a deep breath and stepped into my father's office. The smell of leather and old books mixed with the morning sunlight, wrapping around me like an inheritance. This was where I belonged. Not as the man Talia thought I was, but as the man I'd always been. The man who watched, waited, learned, and then acted when the time was right. The man who didn't need to explain himself to anyone who hadn't earned the right to hear his story. Talia's world had just crumbled, but mine was just beginning to rise. Word spreads quickly in the world Talia had chosen to inhabit, faster than any corporate memo, faster than any rumor mill I'd ever seen. The news about Lucien's father, and the public firing my father had orchestrated, hit the financial networks like a detonation. Headlines sprouted overnight. Former president's son rejected by billionaire CEO's heir. It was a headline that felt like a punchline, like a cautionary tale for anyone who thought name recognition could replace character. And Talia? Her world unraveled just as quickly. I hadn't wanted revenge. Not really. I'd never been that man, the one who burned bridges just to watch them fall. But as I sat in my father's office that day, watching the press releases flood in and the financial channels cycle through Lucien's father's disgrace, I realized karma didn't wait for permission. It worked on its own schedule. Lucien and his father had thought they could build a future on half-truths and illusions. But illusions only hold if you can sell them, and Lucien's sales pitch was already falling apart. Talia tried to reach out to me first, a text at midnight that simply read, "Can we talk?" I read it once, twice, and let it sit there. The same way she'd let my questions sit, unanswered, when she was planning her exit. The same way she dismissed my voice when it didn't match the narrative she wanted to tell. I didn't need to answer her now. I owed her nothing. The next day it was a voicemail, her voice thin and trembling. "I miss who we were," she said. "I didn't mean for it to end like this." I could practically hear Lucien's laughter in the background, like he was the soundtrack to her downfall. But I didn't call her back. I didn't even press play on the message a second time, because that was the difference between us. She thought forgiveness was something you could request when it suited you. But forgiveness, like trust, has to be earned. And she'd spent too many years cashing checks she hadn't earned. I knew she was unraveling. I knew the luxury credit cards she'd once waved like golden tickets were declining at every boutique counter, that the whispers around her dinner parties had turned from envy to pity. That's the thing about social circles built on status. They're as fragile as the glass of the wine glasses she used to brag about. One crack and the whole thing shatters. My father called me into his office one afternoon, a rare grin on his usually stoic face. "Your old friend Lucien just tried to sell shares in Gold Wave Group to one of our partners," he said. leaning back in his chair. Didn't know the firm was under investigation. The partner sent it straight to me. He slid the folder across the desk. Inside were the reports, the signatures, the desperate emails. I didn't need to read them to know what they meant. Lucien was finished. And Talia? She'd hitched her wagon to the wrong star. I smiled, not with triumph, but with relief. Relief that I'd never have to carry the burden of explaining myself to her again. Relief that the truth always found its way to the surface, even when it took its time. And relief that, in the end, I hadn't had to lift a finger to make it happen. As I left his office, I caught my reflection in the glass, steady, unflinching, the same man I'd always been. The man she'd never cared to know. I'd never been the placeholder she'd thought I was. I was the heir to a legacy built on sweat, strategy, and a quiet strength she'd never recognized. So when I ignored her messages, I wasn't being cruel. I was simply being done. Because I was already becoming someone new, someone who no longer had to shrink for anyone. And if Talia ever wondered who I really was, all she had to do was look at the headlines, at the stories of Lucien's downfall, at the smirk on my father's face when he handed me that folder. The smirk that broke her. My father always told me that true power never announces itself. It waits, watches, and strikes only when the time is right, like the wind that shifts the sails of a ship before anyone knows it's moved. I felt that wind in Zurich. The day I landed at the summit, the air smelled of rain and ambition. It was the kind of place where the elite gathered to posture, champagne in hand, speeches rehearsed to perfection. But I wasn't there to posture. I was there to build. The summit was all polished stone and glass, like a fortress designed to reflect wealth and hide weakness. I'd been sent by my father to represent Ellison Holdings, a test, no doubt, to see if I could hold the family name in a room full of sharks. I didn't wear the sharpest suit or the most expensive watch. I didn't need to. I knew that real power didn't live in what you wore, but in what you knew. I walked through those glass doors carrying my father's lessons in my chest. That's where I met Sabrina. She wasn't like Talia. She wasn't dripping in labels or clinging to someone's last name like a lifeboat. She was wearing a simple navy dress, her hair pulled back in a neat bun, her eyes sharp with curiosity and wit. She was representing a renewable energy firm that was quietly revolutionizing storage solutions, a game-changer for our logistics divisions if we played it right. When she shook my hand, her grip was firm, her gaze steady. I liked her instantly. We talked over coffee during the second day of the summit. No sales pitch, no forced charm, just two people who understood the game and respected each other's place in it. She asked smart questions about my strategies, the logistics of supply chains, the future of infrastructure investments. No one had ever cared to ask me those questions before, not even Talia, who'd only ever wanted to know which restaurant I was taking her to next. Sabrina made me feel like the man I'd always wanted to be seen as, not a placeholder, but a partner. When I asked about her company's vision, she leaned in, eyes bright. It's not about the money, she said. It's about building something that lasts. Real change. Real impact. Money follows integrity. I watched her speak, and for the first time in a long time, I believed every word. Because I lived in a world where money always came first, and I'd seen the ruin it left behind. Talia had worshipped it. Lucien had tried to buy it. But Sabrina? She understood that power didn't look like money, it looked like trust, like loyalty, like the quiet moments when the real work got done. Over the next few weeks, Sabrina and I built a partnership, slow, deliberate, honest. She challenged me, made me defend my ideas, forced me to think bigger than I had before. And in the process, I found myself drawn to her in a way I hadn't expected. She made me laugh, not the polite laughter I'd faked for Talia's dinner parties, but the kind that lived in my chest and warmed my bones. Meanwhile, Lucien and Talia's world was crumbling. Their photos from galas grew fewer and further between, the smiles more forced, the captions more desperate. The gold-plated credit cards that had once opened every door now came back declined. The whispers in the boardrooms grew louder, that the Marlowe name wasn't what it used to be, that the shine had tarnished. I watched it all from a distance, no longer invested in her story. She'd made her choice. Sabrina never asked about my past, never asked why I'd stayed silent while Talia had twisted the knife. She just saw me for who I was now, a man who'd survived betrayal and come out stronger. That was enough for her. And that was enough for me. One evening, as we wrapped up a late-night call about a joint project, she laughed. "You know," she said, "you're not what I expected from the Ellison name. I thought I'd meet a polished shark. But you're real." Her voice softened, and I could hear the smile in it. "That's rare around here." I smiled too, because for the first time in a long time, I felt like myself again. No titles, no expectations, no illusions. Just the man I'd always been beneath the silence. The man who'd learned that power wasn't in the flash, but in the steady, unwavering hand that built something worth keeping. And with Sabrina, I knew I'd finally found someone who saw that too. The first time I saw the lawsuit, I was sitting in my father's office, reviewing quarterly reports with a cup of bitter black coffee in hand. The envelope was thick, official, and sealed with that kind of precision that only comes from legal teams with more money than scruples. I recognized the name on the letterhead immediately. Goldwave Group, the Marlowe family's conglomerate. The same family Lucien had bragged about for months. The same family that had tried to pass off their influence as legitimacy. Inside the envelope was a neatly printed document, stamped and signed, outlining a breach of contract so thorough and undeniable that even the most expensive lawyer couldn't spin it into a misunderstanding. My father had always taught me to read every line, so I did. Every detail of Lucien's backroom deals, every missed payment, every broken promise. It was all there, black and white. Proof that while Lucien had been busy playing the role of the golden boy, he'd also been leaving a trail of unpaid debts and angry partners. The best part? The signature at the bottom of the suit wasn't mine. It was my father's. "We no longer tolerate legacy corruption," the statement read. I could almost hear his voice in those words, calm, measured, but edged with the steel that made grown men nervous. This wasn't a small-time complaint. This was a declaration of war. And in that moment, I realized Lucien and Talia's world had finally come full circle. Talia called me 3 days later. I almost didn't answer. The screen lit up with her name, the same name I deleted from my favorites months ago. But some part of me needed to hear it, to hear the desperation I knew would be there. When I answered, her voice came through small, uncertain, like the echo of the woman who used to sit across from me at dinner tables. "Jared," she said, "I made a mistake. I didn't know. I could have let her talk. I could have given her the space to pour out the excuses I'd heard rehearsed in my mind 1,000 times before. But I'd spent too long living in her illusions. I'd spent too many nights pretending that my silence made me weak. And now? Now I had no reason to pretend. You knew exactly what you wanted," I said, my voice calm, measured, the way my father had taught me to talk when the stakes were highest. "You just didn't expect me to be it." The silence on the other end was deafening. I could hear her breathing, could picture her lips parted, searching for the right words to draw me back in. But there were no words left. The bridge between us had burned the day she'd handed me those divorce papers. Everything after that had been smoke and mirrors, and I learned to see through all of it. She tried again. "Please, Jared." I didn't understand. I thought. I didn't let her finish. "Talia," I said, my tone like a gavel. "You made your choice. Now you live with it." I hung up without waiting for her reply. The weight that lifted off my chest felt like freedom. I'd carried her expectations for too long, always wondering what I could have done differently, what I could have said to make her stay. But the truth was, nothing I did would have ever been enough. Because she'd never wanted me. She'd wanted the image of success she thought she could sculpt out of me, like I was a piece of marble waiting to be carved. The lawsuit made headlines within days. Lucien's father's name was splashed across the financial pages. The whispers of fraud and corruption no longer whispers but declarations. Boardrooms that once opened their doors to him now locked them tight. I watched from the sidelines as the empire he'd tried to inherit crumbled under the weight of its own lies. Talia's social media went dark. No more curated brunches, no more designer outfits. The silence was its own kind of justice. My father called me into his office that Friday, his face a mask of quiet satisfaction. "I saw the way you handled her," he said. "You didn't bend. You didn't explain yourself. That's the mark of a leader, Jared." He leaned back, studying me with eyes that had seen too many betrayals to be surprised by one more. "She'll regret this. Maybe she already does. But that's not our concern anymore." I nodded, feeling the truth of his words settle in my bones. I'd spent too long living for other people's expectations, Talia's, Lucien's, the boardrooms. But this was my life, my empire, and it would rise on the foundation my father had built, not on the illusions Talia had chased. As I left his office, I passed by the conference room where Talia had once delivered those divorce papers in a designer bag. I paused, looking at the empty chairs, the polished table, the sunlight streaming in like a spotlight on the stage where she'd performed her last act. And I felt nothing but relief. Because the final chapter had been written, and it wasn't hers anymore. It was mine. Months had passed since that elevator door had closed on Lucien and Talia, but the echoes of that day still lingered in the hallways of Ellison Holdings. The headlines had quieted, the courtrooms had settled, and the financial pages had moved on to the next scandal. But for me, the true victory wasn't in the headlines or the whispered apologies I'd never hear. It was in the quiet room where I now stood, my name newly engraved on the glass door, Jared R. Ellison, CEO. I paused at the threshold, one hand resting on the cool glass. The letters felt solid, real, like a promise fulfilled. For so long, I'd lived in the shadow of my own name, letting others define it, shrink it, shape it into something that fit their needs. Talia had seen my silence as weakness. Lucien had seen it as an opportunity. But they both missed the truth. My silence was a choice, a strategy. The same way my father taught me to pause before I spoke, to study a room before I acted, to wait for the moment when the ground beneath their feet would crumble without me raising my voice. Inside, the office felt like a kingdom I'd inherited and earned at the same time. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the skyline like a painting, towers of glass and steel that my family had helped build. The city felt different from up here, smaller, quieter, a reminder that power wasn't about noise. It was about presence. I stepped inside, the carpet muffling my steps, the air carrying the faint scent of leather and old paper. My father's old desk had been moved to storage, replaced by one I'd chosen myself. Walnut, clean lines, no unnecessary shine. It was mine, just like this roll. I set my briefcase on the table and exhaled, letting the weight of the last year roll off my shoulders. The divorce, the betrayal, the headlines, the lawsuits, they'd all been storms I'd weathered. And now, here I was, in the eye of the storm's calm, with everything I needed right in front of me. My father's voice echoed in my head. The measure of a man isn't what he takes, Jared, it's what he builds. I'd carried that lesson through every deal, every meeting, every moment. Talia thought I was just a placeholder in her story. She never saw the man who was building something bigger than her reflection. A soft knock on the door broke my thoughts. I turned to see Sabrina standing there, her silhouette framed by the morning light. She held our baby girl in her arms, a small bundle of warmth wrapped in a pink blanket, her tiny face peeking out like a secret worth protecting. Sabrina's smile was quiet but sure, the kind that reminded me why I'd fought so hard to become this man. She crossed the threshold and held our daughter out to me. "She's asking for you," she said, her voice soft but strong. I reached out, my hand steady as I cradled my daughter against my chest. She was so small, her breath warm against my collarbone, her tiny hand curling around my finger like she'd known me her whole life. I'd never felt anything so real. No boardroom triumph, no acquisition, no headline had ever made me feel like this. Like every choice I'd made, every betrayal I'd survived, had been leading me to this moment. Sabrina stood close, her hand resting lightly on my arm. "You've come a long way, Jared," she said. Her eyes shone with pride, not for the title on the door but for the man standing in it. "And you did it without becoming them." I knew who she meant. Talia, Lucien, every person who'd tried to reduce me to their expectations. I smiled at her, feeling the weight of every silent night, every unspoken word finally lifted. I looked down at my daughter and saw in her the legacy my father had taught me to build, not just buildings or balance sheets, but people who mattered, who saw beyond the noise. Talia had chased crowns and titles, thinking they made her powerful, but I learned that real power was quiet, patient. It didn't need applause or headlines. It thrived in the silent strength of knowing exactly who you were. As I settled into my chair, holding my daughter close, I glanced at the city below. There would always be people like Talia and Lucien, hungry for status, loud with ambition, chasing a version of power they'd never understand. Let them. Because I already had everything I needed. The intercom buzzed gently. "Mr. Ellison, your meeting in conference room B is ready." Kylie's voice came through, steady as always. I pressed the button, my voice calm. "Give me 5 minutes, please." I turned back to Sabrina, who watched me with that smile that never needed words. "Stay with me," I said. She nodded, settling into the seat across from me, our daughter between us. I didn't need to rehearse what I'd say in that meeting. The numbers were strong. The team was ready. The empire I'd inherited and rebuilt was solid. And the man at the head of it? He was no longer the man Talia thought he was. He was the man who'd survived it all, betrayal, divorce, loss, and had come out stronger on the other side. As I signed off on the final papers for a $300 million acquisition, I felt the past finally let go. No fireworks. No dramatic monologue. Just a quiet victory in a room that belonged to me, with the people who mattered beside me. That's what winning really feels like, I thought. Not a roar of applause or a headline screaming my name. Just the calm of a job well done, a legacy protected, a life rebuilt on my own terms. Let the world chase crowns and titles. Let them measure power by how loud they could shout. I learned that the greatest victories were the ones that needed no audience. And in that quiet room, with my name on the door and my family in my arms, I knew I'd already won.